Okay, we were looking at the 12th of the 13 Midos in Perek Rishon of the Tomer Devorah, and you'll remember that is Asher Nishpat Alav, which is the bris that Hashem made with Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and therefore even someone who is not worthy of consideration, Hashem has rachamim on them because of the haftacha that God made with Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and we say this in davening every day. V'zocher chastei avos, he remembers the loving kindness of the avos, all the avos. Umevi gayel livnei v'neihem, and he brings redemption to their descendants. L'man shemo, for the glory of Hashem's name. Bi'ava, he brings it with love. Right? This is birchas avos. This is the most important bracha of Shemona Esrei. That the halacha is that if you daven Shemona Esrei without kavana, you don't have to repeat it. But if you didn't have kavana in avos, you're mechuyev. We're not to do that because we don't have kavana anytime. So the repetition is likely not to be good either. But me'ikar adin, if you didn't have kavana in birchas avos, you would be mechuyev to recite Shemona Esrei again. So I think we ended off with I introduced a kasha of the Ramban in Chumash. The Ramban, of course, was several hundred years before the Ramak. And the Ramban asked the kasha that by the Chet HaEgel, Moshe Rabbeinu uses two arguments when he pleads for mercy. Number one, he says, if you destroy the Jewish people, the nations of the world will say you didn't have the power to defeat the Canaanites, so therefore you figured you'd finish off the Jewish people before they get to Canaan. And therefore the Umos HaOlam are going to say that God is a weak God that is ineffectual. That's called Chilul Hashem. And the second argument is, remember the covenant that you made with Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, right? So Moshe Rabbeinu has two arguments after the Egel, but after the Chet HaMeraglim, Moshe Rabbeinu does bring up that the nations of the world will say you don't have the power to bring them to Eretz Yisrael. But Moshe Rabbeinu does not bring up the Zechus Avos, or the Bris Avos. So the question becomes, why by the Egel does he invoke the Bris of the Avos? It seems to be Bris Avos because he mentions the Shavua, and by the Meraglim, he does not bring up that argument. Yeah?
Why is even the Chilul Hashem argument effective argument that it seems that this day in Israel, I mean even today, that not everyone recognizes Hashem, that there's lots of why does that sway Hashem even in an argument?
Well, once again, you're correct that even after all the miracles Hashem does, people still do not recognize. But this would add to it, meaning to say a certain percentage of people are certainly influenced when they see the power of Hashem. And if Hashem would not manifest that power, then a certain number of people would feel Hashem doesn't have the power. In other words, it's not an all or nothing situation. It's not that, if you destroy us, then nobody will believe in you. And if you let us go to Eretz Yisrael, everybody will believe in you. You're going to lose people one way or the other. But the question becomes almost a cost-benefit calculus, that more people will reject Hashem if he destroys Bnei Yisrael than will reject Hashem if he brings Bnei Yisrael into the land. So it's simply a question of, what's going to be better on the balance of Kiddush Hashem versus Chilul Hashem. So the Ramban says the following argument. The Ramban says, and let me be makdim the Ramban's idea with a joke, although the Ramban obviously doesn't say the joke. The old Yiddish joke is, what is the definition of chutzpah? So the definition of chutzpah is the person who kills his parents and then asks for mercy from the court because they're an orphan, and therefore the court should have rachamim. Now that's an old Yiddish joke. That's a joke that goes back at least 100 years. But it's interesting that there are modern criminal trials where what looks like so preposterous people actually do. You may have heard about the Menendez brothers, who were two teenagers who allegedly killed their parents. And they actually asked the court for mercy because they have no parents, and therefore, who's going to take care of them? Who's going to care about them, and the like. So, as they say, life imitates art, and sometimes things that people consider to be like a whole shtus actually happen in real life. In fact, I'll give you another example of that. It's not Nogeyat, this sugya at all, but Rav Chaim Volozhiner in Chelek Aleph of Chelek Aleph of Nefesh HaChaim has a long arichos, which is really a refutation of Chassidus, although he doesn't mention Chassidus, in which he makes the point that although it's very, very important to have Avas Hashem, Yiras Hashem, and to have spiritual connection to God, it can never be at the expense of following halacha exactly, because there were certain groups in Hasidus, certain groups, not the Balatanya, but certain groups, who took the position that the most important aspect of Avodas Hashem is the inner spiritual feeling that you have. And if halacha interferes with that inner spiritual feeling, then it's worthwhile to ignore halacha. So an example would be, let's say Zman Kriya Shema is whatever, 7:30 in the morning, but for you to get up at 7, you'd be very exhausted and your Kriya Shema would not have kavana, but if you can sleep until 11, you'll have a gavaldiga kavana in your Kriya Shema. Love God, fear God. So the thought would be, it might be kedai to forget about Zman Kriya Shema in order to express, your spirituality. So this is called the highfalutin term for this is the antinomian tendency of mystical movements. Antinomian simply means we don't like to follow rules. Rules interfere with our spirituality. You see this, of course, in the modern world all the time with New Age spirituality and the like. They say, what are you telling me? God cares if I rip toilet paper on Shabbos? Like, how does that, I don't want to focus on this rule and that rule and that rule. I want to focus on Hashem. So the whole Chelek Aleph of Nefesh HaChaim, or Shar Aleph of Nefesh HaChaim, is designed to show that ultimately the only way we can really have a relationship with Hashem is following all of the pratim of halacha. And then, when you follow the pratim of halacha, you try to then grow in spiritual feelings of Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem. But it has to be built on the foundation of a halachic framework. You can't have a true relationship with Hashem unless you're... Now again, I'm not talking about Tinok Shenishber. I mean, that's a separate sugya. People who were not raised that way, that's a separate issue. But we're talking about here people who know the halacha, but they have made a calculated decision that the halacha should yield in favor of enhancing their spirituality. Now, Rav Chaim Volozhiner does not identify Hasidim. He does not refer to Hasidus at all, but it's very clear that he is addressing that hashkafa. And the whole Shar Aleph is the importance of Maisa. By the way, let me point out that the Baal HaTanya in Tanya does exactly the same thing. So, in a way, the Baal HaTanya, I don't know if Chabad would like this or hate this, he's almost the least Hasidic of Hasidim, because the Baal HaTanya was a stickler, so to speak, for halachic obedience. So Nefesh HaChaim and Tanya are very, very similar works in a lot of ways. In fact, Lubavitcher Rebbe claims that Rav Chaim Volozhiner, because Tanya came out a little earlier, that Rav Chaim Volozhiner read the Tanya and was influenced by it. I'm not sure if I would go that far, but one should know that the Baal HaTanya himself was criticized, not only by, obviously as a Hasidic Rebbe, he was criticized by Misnagdim, but the Baal HaTanya was very controversial among Hasidim, other than Chabad, because he was too much of a Litvak. He was too much like the Misnagdim in that way. Yeah.
How would that argument that the Nefesh HaChaim brings? What's the response to various parts of Nevi'im that say I don't want your kabbanos if you don't have the right intention, and various
Yeah.
verses.
Yeah. So I don't know if Rav Chaim Volozhiner specifically addresses this, but I would say that an answer might be that korbanos fall in a unique category. Meaning, you don't find the Nevi'im say, "Oh, I don't want your kashrus." I don't want your Shabbos. It doesn't say that. But korbanos, once again, you see, here's the thing. In the ancient world, korbanos, sacrifices, were a form of bribery and protection money. You're paying off Jupiter, or whatever it is, so he shouldn't harass you or he should bless you. Now, we don't look at korbanos that way. Korbanos are not bribing God. God does not have a penchant for barbecued meat. Rather, the whole tachlis of korbanos, as the Ramban himself explains, is that by recognizing that there, but for the grace of God goes me, I become changed. A korban has a meaning only if it changes you. And not only that, but if you bring a korban and you live an immoral life, then the korban becomes sinful, because what you're saying is you're looking at the korban as if you're bribing God with mafia money. You see, it's not just a korban with an immoral life is worthless. A korban with an immoral life is sinful. And that is actually a pasuk in Mishlei. The pasuk in Mishlei says, Zevach Rishayim, the korban of evil people, is a ta'eva, is an abomination. You see why? Because it's profoundly offensive to God. You're saying to God, take the bribe. Right? So korban, I think, may be a special sugya. That's why you don't find that God says, I mean, if a guy is dishonest in business, that's very bad. It is very bad. You know, unfortunately, we sometimes don't criticize it enough. But we're not going to say to a person, and Hashem is not going to say to her, oh, why are you keeping Shabbos? You're dishonest in business. I mean, the answer is, whatever mitzvahs you do, do. You know, we're not going to say that because you're sinful in one important area. In fact, the guy's married to a guy. I mean, there's no reason a person shouldn't marry a guy, yeah. But there's no reason why such a person shouldn't put on tefillin and shouldn't daven and shouldn't make kiddush and Shabbos. Right? So it's only korbanos that we have the unique idea of Zevach Hashem She'eva, yeah.
So if someone were to have such a confused hashkafa that they view even saying the Shema as bribery, would it be better that they don't say the Shema?
Well, I think in some ways, you know, you're I don't know. And I would say that he still should, but you know, I don't know. You know, I mean, bribery is a tricky. See, I think there's bribery and bribery, meaning to say, if I think I'm bribing God by doing mitzvos, that's a little different than saying I'm bribing God by giving him food. I mean, I think one is more of a Megusham idea. In fact, did you hear this story? Just amazing. It's amazing story. These stories always come out about, again, the female soldier that was kind of miraculously just liberated by the IDF. She was in captivity. I mean, how do they find her? Literally a needle in a haystack, and somehow they're able to extricate her. She was not released by Hamas, the IDF. So apparently, you know, she's not from a religious family that much, although there are many beautiful stories about her mother, like praying to Hashem. But apparently she had an uncle, and the uncle was not a Shomer Shabbos, but he had religious kids. And they were trying to tell him, hey, why don't you keep Shabbos for our cousin, for your niece, and we'll see what happens. And he said something that really you're not supposed to say, but he said, okay, if God releases, you know, whatever her name is, Ori, I will keep Shabbos permanently. And of course, what happened is she gets released, and he said, you know, I didn't think this would happen. I thought maybe she'd get released with everybody else, but just her. He says, Hashem is talking to me. Hashem is talking to me. So he says, it's not possible, right? So in a sense, people make those deals with God, which is not proper. It's definitely not proper, but we still would not say don't keep Shabbos, you know, under those circumstances. So Rav Chaim Volozhin gives an example. He gives a different example of the absurdity. You'll see why I'm bringing up the absurdity of the idea that the ikar is your kavanah. He says, let's imagine a person makes Seder, but they're so tired Pesach night, right? Seder night, you've been working, cleaning the house, especially the women, so hard. So you figure, listen, let's make it an early night. I'll go to sleep Pesach nights, 10 o'clock at night or 9 o'clock at night, and the next morning I'll make a gewaldige Seder. That would be a shtus. A Seder the next morning is worthless. When you do Hashem's Ratzah and you then augment it with Kavana, with Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem, but Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem cannot exist in a vacuum that is devoid of doing God's will. Right, so that's an example of, an absurdity. So it's interesting. I was once giving a shir years ago to a group of people who were not religious, and after I mentioned this as the height of absurdity, so a woman said, "Oh yeah, we did that last year. We couldn't get the family together for a Seder, so we decided to make it the Shabbos after Pesach. And it was like the best Seder we ever had. Just Shabbos after Pesach, everybody's relaxed, etc. So what's interesting is that things that were literally incomprehensible, an example of an absurdity that would never happen in a million years, it actually happened. So that's the same thing with the orphan, have pity on the orphan because they killed their parents. Okay, now, how is this connected to the Ramban, right? The Ramban had a kasha. So here's what the Ramban says. The Ramban says, in order to be Zaycha to Bris Avos, you have to connect yourself to what the Avos were machshav. Meaning you have to say, I live by their ideals. I live by the Yesodos that were dear to them, that were important to them. When I affirm what the Avos stood for, then I have a zechus that comes from the Avos. So here is what the Ramban surprisingly says. He says, the Chet HaEgel was a tremendous Aveira, obviously. But it actually was not a repudiation of the Avos. Now here the Ramban goes l'shitasei, actually, because the Ramban explains, it's connected to another Ramban, that the Chet HaEgel was not Avodah Zarah Mamish. The Chet HaEgel was not a rejection of God. It was a mistake in how to serve God. Because it's very clear from the Psukim itself, the Ramban says, that the Egel was perceived not as a substitute for God, but as a substitute for Moshe Rabbeinu. That's what the Pasuk says. The Pasuk says that Moshe Rabbeinu was late, or they thought he was late. And therefore, they thought that Moshe Rabbeinu was the intermediary that channeled divine energy into Klal Yisrael through Moshe Rabbeinu. And Moshe Rabbeinu is gone, so we need a channeler, we need an intermediary. And the Ramban says, Al Pi Kabbalah, they saw the Egel as one of the four faces on God's divine throne. Right? There's the cow, or the Egel rather, and there's the Adam, and there's the Aryeh, and there's the Nesher, etc. These are four faces on the Kisei HaKavod. And the Ramban writes that the face of the shore, the face of the ox, channels Hashgacha Pratis in desolate desert areas. And we don't even understand that process. But be it as it may, they believed in Hashem, but they thought they needed an intermediary. Now, Avada, that's Asr. That's a very big sin. But it was not a repudiation of Emunah in Hashem, and therefore Moshe Rabbeinu could still invoke Zechus Avos on their behalf. Ma she'ein kein, the Chet HaMeraglim, which was a rejection of the gift of Eretz Yisrael, and the Avos had a great, great chavivas haaretz. So under those circumstances, they're rejecting what was dear to the Avos. Therefore, there is not going to be Zechus Avos. And the only remaining argument that Moshe Rabbeinu had was the argument that was based on Chilul Hashem. This is what the Ramban says. The Ramban says that you can only invoke Zechus Avos if you don't reject what the Avos stood for. And that includes not just something like belief in Hashem, but that even includes denying the importance of Eretz Yisrael, denying your ability to live in Eretz Yisrael, and the like. So it seems to me that the Ramban is putting a bit of a higher standard to qualify for Zechus Avos than the Ramak. The Ramak seems to be saying, oh, you're nothing, you're totally unworthy, there's no redeeming quality of you whatsoever, but nevertheless, there is going to be that bris avos or zechus avos that remains. On the other hand, we see, according to the Ramban, that it's shaykh to even lose that. Now, it may be, we're going to see in a minute, that in the 13th Midah, the Ramak says, but he doesn't explain when, that we have a 13th Midah for those who don't even have zechus avos. But he doesn't say why. So maybe he's alluding to the Ramban, or maybe there may be other reasons. I don't know. But in Midah number 12, when he describes this bris avos, the bris avos actually, he seems to be making it unconditional, which is not like the Ramban. On the other hand, in Midah 13, he does seem to say it's qualified, which may be like the Ramban. So you can't really be machriya because he doesn't fully explain it. But be it as it may, it's a chashuva Ramban that chibas ha'oretz is part of how you connect to bris avos. That when you reject chibas ha'oretz, you have a problem with zechus avos, as we see by the Meraglim, when Moshe Rabbeinu did not use bris avos in pleading for mercy. By the way, let me just remind you, again, not apropos of this sugya, that there's another pitfall you have to be very, very careful about. And this is the phenomenon that we discussed a while ago in Hilchos Chuva, where based on a Gemara in Kedushin, the Rambam says there's such a phenomenon called negative Chuva. What do I mean by this? The same way if I do Averos, and I regret my Averos, and I want to change, Hashem erases the Averos, that's the gift of Chuva. Says the Rambam, there is such a musag that if a person did mitzvos and then did Averos, normally, you'll recall, the Averos do not cancel the mitzvahs. He'll get punished for the Averos, and then he'll get rewarded for his mitzvahs, right? So normally, you don't lose your mitzvahs by Averos. But says the Rambam, if a person regrets that he did those mitzvahs, I call that negative tshuva. I am nischaret that I did those mitzvahs. I wish I never did them. That's much, much worse than simply doing Averos. When you regret the mitzvahs that you've done, you lose them. The same way, charata can destroy your Averos. That's a good thing. Charata can destroy your mitzvahs. Now, this sometimes is an issue that people face living in Eretz Yisrael. Person makes aliyah, person comes to Eretz Yisrael, and it's a hard life, and let's assume that they feel that they can't stay here. That's, again, I'm not knocking anybody or dumping on anybody. So they go back. So if the pshat is they go back, but their attitude is, I'm happy that I was here for a year. I am happy, but I'm just not able to continue it. Then Baruch Hashem, for that year, they still have the sechar of the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, like the Ramban, and they will get reward for it. But if, as is often the case, this can happen to even the most frum person, they kind of have the feeling, I wish I never lived here. I wish I never came. Which is not so difficult to come to if life was really hard for them. Then you have to understand, then chas v'shalom, they've lost the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael based on Taya ala Rishaynais, because they have charata. So it's important to understand that even if you can't be mamshich a mitzvah, whatever the mitzvah is, even if you can't continue a mitzvah because you feel it's beyond your ability, you should never regret the fact that you did the mitzvah, because then you're hit with a double whammy. I mean, on one hand, you did something that was very hard for you, but you have no reward for it whatsoever because it totally gets erased. I mean, if you suffered, you might as well get benefit from it. You might as well get schar in the mitzvah that you did. Yeah.
Moshe didn't mention the merit of the avos. Did he just not do that because it wasn't relevant? Because the would it have been like a korban, a bribery korban? Would have actually been a bad thing to try to say that, oh, have our ancestors protect us when we're going against our ancestors anyways? It would have been a demerit as opposed to just not something that was relevant to defense.
I'm not sure if it would be a demerit because Lamaisa, you're still saying, hey, I come from, great, great righteous people. But it wouldn't help. Hashem says, you get the benefit of your righteous yichus when you try to walk in their ways and follow their ways. It's like an old saying, yichus, right? Some people are blessed with yichus. I don't mean just Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. That's the yichus of a Jewish person. But, my grandfather was this, the great rabbi, or whatever it would be. So someone once described it, yichus is like a bunch of zeros, but you have to have a 1. So if you have a 1 in front of the zeros, then the more zeros you have, then Baruch Hashem. The 1 can become a million. But if you have a bunch of zeros without a 1 in front of it, then all you have is a bunch of zeros. So if you are not the one trying to walk in those ways, then you might find yourself with zeros, and the zechus of us is not going to help you. Yeah.
Can a person undo his regret and then, like, once he like listen to this year, say, actually
Yes. You can do tshuva on regret. 100%. You are correct. But you got to be sincere. Yeah, but you're correct. This can happen infinite numbers of times, and we all hope before our death we will do tshuva on whatever regret we had for whatever mitzvahs that we have done. By the way, there's a famous question. Again, it's not our sugya, but it comes up that Rabbi Chanan Wasserman asked the Chafetz Chaim. As you know, Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, who died in the Holocaust, Hashem Yinkum Damai, on Kovna, even though he was in America the year before, but he went back almost knowing he was going to his death. He didn't want to abandon his Talmidim, his yeshiva. But Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, who was a great gadol himself and a great Rosh Yeshiva, he considered himself a Talmud of the Chafetz Chaim. And he was mevatel himself, legamri, to the Chafetz Chaim. Ad kidei kach, that I think the whole month of Elul, but for sure Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, he would leave his own yeshiva. He was a Rosh Yeshiva to go to Radin, to be under the Chafetz Chaim. Very unusual. A Rosh Yeshiva normally bedafka spends Yomim Noraim with the yeshiva, but he went to Radin, and he was so close to the Chafetz Chaim that they say a ma'aseh, so many ma'asim, where the Chafetz Chaim gave a shmooze, and somebody remarked to Rabbi Chanan that Chafetz Chaim said the same thing last year. So Rabbi Chanan said, no, he added 6 words. That's Rabbi Chanan was so medayik in everything the Chafetz Chaim said. So we asked the Chafetz Chaim the following kasha. The Mesilas Yesharim writes that Chuva is a miraculous process. Chuva is not a logical process. Because the same way if I murdered somebody, all the regret in the world is not going to erase the murder. A sin is a reality. See, we don't look at it that way. An aveira is a reality. It's a blemish on the soul. I've destroyed spiritual worlds. How can my remorse and my regret change the reality? You can't change the past. And the Ramchal writes, you're right. Chuva is a miraculous process that goes beyond the rational. It is God's gift to mankind, or at least to Klal Yisrael, to non-Jews as well. Hashem gave a gift that Hashem treats the akirat hamachshava, the uprooting of your thoughts, your regret, ki'ilu, you changed the past. Right? This is the Ramchal. So says Rabbi Chanan, if it's not a logical process, if it's only like a gezerah sakasa, a special gift of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it should only work for you. It shouldn't work against you. Then there ought not to be negative tshuva. In other words, if I did mitzvahs and now I regret them, you're telling me I lose the mitzvahs? Why? You're telling me intrinsically you can't change the past. But Hashem gave you a gift, you can erase Averas. Okay. But if Hashem gave me a gift, that should only work, I can erase the Averas. but it shouldn't mean I can erase the mitzvahs. Which means if tshuva is indeed a miraculous process, then why should there be a phenomenon called negative tshuva? Because the chayre, you shouldn't be able to change that past. L'maisa, I kept Shabbos. L'maisa, I learned Torah. L'maisa, I lived in Eretz Yisrael. So the Chavetz Chaim gave the following answer. The Chavetz Chaim said that we know there are two types of tshuva. There are many ways of slicing tshuva, but two common ways of differentiating is tshuva me'ahava and tshuva me'yira. So tshuva me'yira is when I do tshuva in order to avoid the punishments. I'm scared. In other words, I know there's Gehenna and I know there's punishments even in this world, and I really don't want to get those punishments, so I better do tshuva in order to avoid punishments. That's called tshuva me'yira. As you would expect, it's a lower tshuva, but it's still a valid tshuva. But then there's tshuva me'ava. I don't do tshuva to avoid punishment. I do tshuva because I love Hashem, and I want to give Hashem nachas, and I want to give Hashem simcha, and therefore I want to change my ways so that God will be happy with me. God will be accepting of me. So says the Chavetz Chaim the following. That which the Ramchal says, that tshuva shouldn't work, but it's a miracle that Hashem lets it work, that only applies to tshuva me'yira. Tshuva me'yira, because tshuva me'yira, you don't really regret the sin, you just regret the consequences. Right, it's like the person that's caught by his parents doing something wrong, so they're sorry. Sometimes you're sorry that you got caught. You're not sorry that you did it, you're sorry you got caught. If you wouldn't get caught, it would be fine. So tshuva me'yira is a gezeres hakasef. But tshuva me'ava, says the Chavetz Chaim, you are genuinely a different person. You really say, that wasn't me, that's not me, I'm a new person. I'm a new person. So the past is not going to be a burden on you. So says the Chavetz Chaim in this way. When you do negative tshuva, it's a funny vocabulary, that is actually like tshuva me'ava, because you're not regretting because you're afraid of something, pumpaker, you're rejecting Hashem. You're regretting because, unfortunately, you're a new person in the opposite direction. So says the Chavetz Chaim, when you're a new person in an opposite direction, so you're disassociating yourself from your past, so your past gets erased in both directions. The mitzvahs get erased, the averos get erased. You see, because in a sense, again, it's funny to say it this way, the taya ala rishainos is like a tshuva me'ava. And therefore, tshuva me'ava is going to work in both directions. It's only tshuva me'yira that is a gzeres hakasov. That logically it shouldn't work because you don't really regret what you did, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu will accept even a tshuva me'yira. Okay, so that is midah number 12, which is Hashem Mishpata Lavaisenu. That's the union of Bris Avos, Sechus Avos, that protects Klal Yisrael to this very day. We then come to midah number 13, which is the last of the pasuk of Micha, and that is Mimei Kedem, the ancient times. And although grammatically it is not really described in the verse as a midah, it just says, Asher nishpata lavaisenu Mimei Kedem, right? You swore to our forefathers a long time ago, but the Talmud Devorah understands this based on the Zohar. A long time ago is a midah of rachamim. And this is the idea that even when a person may not have zechus avos, now he doesn't explain when that's so, but that would fit the Ramban, okay? But there is a certain midah where HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, if you go back far enough, there was a time in this person's life when he did something good. In a way, this is almost a reversal of the Tayal Rishonis, meaning even if he's Tayal Rishonis, but there's a Rachamim, where Hashem goes back and back and back. It's like a reset on a computer, right? They have this idea, go back to the earliest point before things got messed up. What do they call it, a reset or something? What do they call it? Checkpoint, right. So go back to where things were good. There was a time that things were good. And Hashem will look at a person and go back to that reset point and say, you know, there was something there. And if there was something there, I have something to work with. I have some basis of rachamim. And the Ramak actually quotes a pasuk. It's a pasuk that is in Yirmiyahu, and it's been set to Nigunim as well. Zachart, it says, well, it begins Kayamar Hashem, Zacharti loch chesed neurayich, avas kalulo soyach, lechtech acharai bamidbar, b'eretz lo zerua. What does Hashem say? It's also in the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah as well as the Haftorah. It's one of the psukim of Zichronos. Hashem remembers. Zacharti lach, I remember the loving kindness that you showed me in your youth. Speaking to the Jewish people, Lechtech acharai bamidbar, that you followed me into a desert. B'eretz lo zarua, in a land that was not planted, a barren land. Now, the statement itself is quite a remarkable statement. Hashem is, I mean, imagine this. We were slaves in Egypt, right? We weren't having the greatest life there. And Hashem, through 10 plagues and Kriyas Yamsuf, took us out of Mitzrayim in a miraculous way. Hashem is thanking us. Thank you for following me into a desert. I am grateful to you that you were loyal enough to me to go into a place that was dangerous, that was barren. Yes, it wound up, Hashem took care of us, but that took a certain trust on our part. That, now of course you could say, after the 10 plagues, why shouldn't you have trust in God? But still, HaKadosh Baruch Hu considers that to be a tova. It's remarkable. This is a favor we did to him, that we trusted him enough to leave the security of Egypt, because even a slave has a certain security, and to go to a place of danger. So what that means is that even if over the years Am Yisrael moves away from God, God remembers the chesed that we showed him. So you see, it's not even the individual person, because obviously the people Yirmiyahu is talking to, none of them were around at the time of Yetziat Mitzrayim. In other words, this is also a kind of a zechus avos, but it's a zechus avos of going back to an earlier point where your ancestors did something good, and kal v'chomer, an earlier point where you did something good. Right? In a way, this is kind of combining a zechus avos with Mimei Kedem. And therefore, the concept is, HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks into our past to find something good. Something's there. Something's worthwhile. Now, although the Ramak does not mention it, but some of the Meforshim say that this even applies to envisioning a person as a child. Because, at some point, the child was sweet and adorable and good. Right? So go back far enough, right? So the emulation here is obvious. You deal with a difficult person. You deal with a mean person. Again, I'm not talking about Hamas or Hitler. I mean, those are separate categories. But let's just talk about the difficult people that we have to deal with. Of course, that can include ourselves. Sometimes we are the difficult people. But whatever it is. So you say, this guy is mean and aggressive and insulting and pretentious. All sorts of stuff. But try to think back Well, how was he when he was 10 years old, 8 years old, 7 years old, 6 years old, 5 years old, 6 months old? Well, was he cute? Was he adorable? Did he have a nice smile? Did he make people happy? And then you ask yourself, so you go to that reset point, you go back far enough, and then you ask yourself, what on earth happened? How did that cute kid become this disgusting guy? So there, what's going to happen is very interesting. Something must have happened along the way. Now, you don't know. You have no idea what happened. But something must have happened. And then you think about that. And you know what you're going to feel. Instead of anger, you're going to feel rachamim and compassion. You're going to say, how did that beautiful kid turn out to be such a mean, distorted person? He was bruised. He was injured. He was hurt. I don't know what happened, but he was hurt. And then, love can exist in your heart even towards him, and rachamim. It's an amazing, amazing thing. This is such a, again, we're not always in the mind space where we're capable of doing this exercise. But this is a remarkable exercise that can change your whole perception of difficult people. I mean, sometimes we have these conflicts with our parents. I mean, a lot of times we're wrong, but sometimes, parents generally might be difficult. But then you think about, what did your mom and dad go through in life? And then you have a different feeling towards all of those things, right? So this is the idea of Mimei Kedem. Hashem looks back to the good part in a person's life and remembers it. You got to go back to that as well in your relationship with other people. And that in turn is ohr love and forgiveness and understanding. Yeah.
What's the distinction between this midah and midah number 6, ki chavetz chesed hu?
Yeah, so I think the difference is that the chavetz chesed, it's a good question. I think ki chavetz chesed hu is referring to the present, that even if somebody's very, very difficult, but if they are a person who does good things, so even though you're correct, it did talk about he did good things in the past, but that's referring to the fact because at this moment he's not doing chesed, but he's still doing that stuff. This is very different. This is a different situation. This is referring to, and that's why this might be the highest midah, because we're actually going up in ascending order. This is a midah of a guy who left that all behind. He no longer cares. He no longer does any of this stuff. But there was a point at which he was connected with that. Well, okay. If any of you ever read The Great Gatsby in a prior life, that is essentially. I shouldn't say it this way, but that is essentially the point of the 13th midah of the Devorah, in which Gatsby, at one point in his life, genuinely wanted to be a good person and a caring person. And then life changed him in some ways. And that is really the tragedy of that story. But that is what this is about too, the tragedy of a person who starts off good and becomes makulkal. But Hashem is still makir, the good that was in that person. And we have to be makir as well, that good that was in that person. And in that way, mitzidenu, the resentments that we feel now turn into rachmanis for the person. I'm not angry, but how does such a sweet child become such a difficult person? He must have been hurt. He must have been damaged. And then I'm no longer angry. I have a different response to the whole situation. It's an amazing thing. Again, as I say, we're not always able to rise to that level. But if you have the Yishuv Hadas, you can see it can mamish change the way you view everything. So that's why this is actually this 13th midah is considered to be the highest of the midas within this. Okay, so be well.
Thank you for listening to this Awesome production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.